Molly is a friend. Molly is a co-worker. And a lot of times, some of these things happen and it's just uncomfortable to see.
Stephen A. Smith just unleashed a leaked video of Molly Qerim that could change everything. Though she already left ESPN, this explosive footage threatens to erase what's left of her reputation and legacy. What was buried in secrecy is now exposed, and it could be the final blow to her career. Stephen A. Smith really changed everything for Molly Qerim. September 15th, 2025. Just another Monday morning for Molly Qerim as she hosted First Take, completely unaware that her entire world was about to come crashing down. She moderated the show like she had done for nearly a decade, keeping Stephen A. Smith and the other contributors in line, managing egos, and making sure the show flowed smoothly. She said her goodbyes to the audience, not knowing it would be the absolute last time she'd ever sit in that chair. But here's where everything went completely sideways. That very evening, Sports Business Journal dropped an absolute bombshell, reporting that Qerim was leaving ESPN at the end of 2025 after contract negotiations had completely fallen apart. Now imagine being Molly. You're at home, probably winding down from another day at work, when suddenly your phone starts blowing up because your private business negotiations are now front page news across the entire sports media landscape. The impact was immediate and devastating. Qerim felt completely blindsided and took to Instagram that same evening with a statement that revealed just how much this caught her off guard. "This wasn't how I wanted this news to come out." Think about that for a second. 10 years of your professional life suddenly exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. Now here's where this story takes a turn that absolutely nobody saw coming. Instead of quietly riding out her contract until December like the original plan, Molly made a decision that sent shockwaves through ESPN. She decided to leave immediately, not next week, not next month, right then and there. ESPN President Burke Magnus later explained what happened. The one thing that was unexpected was the timing of all this. She, Molly, put out a statement because there was a report on it, so it kind of got out of our respective controls once that happened. This wasn't some planned farewell with heartfelt goodbyes and tribute videos. This was what insiders are calling an emergency exit, and nobody understood this better than former ESPN host Marcellus Wiley, who broke it all the way down.
"This was an abrupt landing. This is an emergency exit. This is an emergency landing. This is one of those for a reason."
Wiley understood something that most people missed. This wasn't just about money or contract terms. Something deeper was going on, and he explained it perfectly.
I give you what a therapist told me. Therapist told me it's not just how things end, it's why are they ending that way?
That's the million-dollar question right there. Why did Molly choose to go out like this? Why did she come to work on Monday and then basically ghost the entire network on Tuesday morning? September 16th, 2025 became one of the most uncomfortable mornings in First Take history. Viewers tuning in expecting to see Stephen A. Smith and Molly Qerim were instead greeted by Smith sitting alone at the desk, visibly emotional as he prepared to break the news that would change everything.
Last night, she abruptly resigned as the host of the show. And to say that I'm quite sad about it is an understatement.
The raw emotion in Stephen A.'s voice was undeniable, but listen carefully to what he said next, because this is where things start getting really interesting.
Molly is a friend. Molly is a co-worker. Molly is somebody that I have leaned on many occasions in the past, as she has done when it comes to me. We've been partners on the show for the last 10 years. And a lot of times, some of these things happen and it's just uncomfortable to see.
Now, Stephen A. tried to keep things professional, but then he said something that raised a lot of eyebrows.
The details, quite frankly, are none of y'all business. But it's not as if I know all the details. It was a contract negotiation that was going on.
Hold up, let me break this down for you. Stephen A. just told us that the details are none of our business, but then immediately started giving us details. He's saying he doesn't know everything, but then he's talking about contract negotiations. This is where people started getting confused, and rightfully so. But what really caught everyone's attention wasn't just what Stephen A. said, it was what Molly didn't say. When she posted her farewell message on Instagram, she thanked the fans, she thanked the show, but there was one glaring omission that sports media insiders immediately picked up on. She didn't mention Stephen A. Smith by name, not once, not even in passing. Now let me put this in perspective for you. When other hosts leave shows, they typically go out of their way to thank their co-hosts. When Shannon Sharpe left Undisputed, he spent 10 minutes dropping names and thanking everyone. But after working side by side with Stephen A. Smith for 10 years, building one of the most successful shows in sports media history together, Molly couldn't bring herself to mention him in her goodbye. As one industry insider put it perfectly,
"Someone you work with for 10 years, you don't even mention them when you're gone. And you don't even give them that like partner heads up on air, like, hey, we did this thing together, this thing is over, right? So that lets you know the business was ugly behind the scenes.
This omission spoke volumes about what was really happening behind the cameras. The relationship between Molly and Stephen A. wasn't just professional. There were some serious personal issues brewing that the public had no idea about. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Marcellus Wiley, who knows this industry inside and out, picked up on something that most people missed about how Molly chose to exit.
Why? Why did Molly want to go out in a blaze? Coming to work Monday and then I ain't coming to work no more, and y'all figure it out. Stephen A. abruptly has to host a show for the whole week.
This is brilliant analysis right here. Wiley understood that Molly's exit wasn't random. It was calculated. She wanted people to notice. She wanted to make a statement. And what better way to make that statement than to force Stephen A. Smith to host the show completely alone, highlighting just how much she contributed to the success of First Take.
Why did it end like that? That's usually an inner cry of like, yo, I want to be noticed. I want y'all to know. I want y'all to feel me. I want y'all to hear me. I want y'all to see me. See how I go out, right? With a bang. She went out with a bang for a reason.
This wasn't just someone quitting their job. This was someone making a statement about their value, their contributions, and their treatment at the network. And the more you understand about what was happening behind the scenes, the more you realize that Molly had every right to be upset. The sports media world was buzzing with speculation, but nobody really understood what had gone wrong until more details started emerging about the contract negotiations and the power dynamics at play within ESPN. Because what we discovered about how these negotiations really work and who has influence over them would completely change how people viewed this entire situation. What happened next would expose some ugly truths about how business really gets done at ESPN, and Stephen A. Smith's role in all of it would become a major part of the story. The money, the power, and the shocking betrayal. Now we're getting into the real meat of this story, the contract negotiations and power struggles that completely destroyed a 10-year partnership. And when you hear about the numbers involved and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, you're going to understand exactly why Molly Qerim felt she had no choice but to walk away in the most dramatic fashion possible. Let's talk money first, because that's where this whole mess really started. According to multiple industry sources, Molly Qerim was making around $500,000 per year as the host of First Take. Now, $500,000 might sound like good money to regular folks, but when you put it in context with what was happening around her at ESPN, the picture becomes absolutely infuriating. Stephen A. Smith, sitting right next to her every single day, was pulling down over $20 million per year. Let me repeat that, $20 million. That means Stephen A. was earning literally 40 times more money than Molly, despite the fact that they were both essential parts of the same incredibly successful show. But here's what makes this even more insulting. While Molly was fighting for basic respect and fair compensation, she was watching other ESPN personalities who weren't even hosting daily shows earned significantly more than she was. Think about how demoralizing that must have been. You're the co-host of the network's flagship morning show, and you're being paid less than people who host shows that can't even find a consistent audience. Now, Molly wasn't just asking for more money to stay in her current role. She was asking for expanded opportunities within ESPN. Specifically, she wanted the chance to host her own show, following the Max Kellerman model of transitioning from First Take contributor to having her own platform. This wasn't some unreasonable demand from someone unproven. This was a decade-long veteran asking for natural career progression. But ESPN's response revealed everything about the power structure within that organization. They not only refused to give her expanded opportunities, but they also weren't willing to significantly increase her compensation for staying in her current role. Essentially, they told her, you can stay in your current position for roughly the same money or you can leave. That's it. No growth, no progression, no recognition of her contributions. Here's where this story gets really dark, because we need to talk about Stephen A. Smith's role in all of this. Stephen A. isn't just the host of First Take, he's also an executive producer of the show. That means he has significant input into major decisions about the show, including personnel decisions and budget allocations. Think about how messed up this dynamic is. Molly is essentially negotiating with someone who sits next to her every day, someone who benefits from keeping her salary lower because it means more money available for other aspects of the show. When Stephen A. constantly calls First Take his show, he's not just being egotistical, he literally has executive power over the production. The extent of Stephen A.'s influence within ESPN became crystal clear through some revealing stories. Listen to this insight about how things really work.
When he signs off on you, when he signs for you, you get what you want. But guess what? There's a flip to it as well. When he doesn't sign off on you, when he doesn't sign for you, you don't get what you want.
This power dynamic explains so much about what happened with other first-take personalities over the years. Consider the cases of Carrie Champion, Max Kellerman, and Shannon Sharpe, all personalities who left under circumstances suggesting they didn't have Stephen A.'s full support. The Shannon Sharpe situation is particularly telling. Industry insiders noted that Stephen A. seemed to have advanced the knowledge of Sharpe's fate and was quick to publicly comment even as the situation was unfolding. This suggests Stephen A. was present in executive meetings where personnel decisions were being made, meetings that Sharpe himself wasn't part of. Now let's talk about what was really happening during Molly's contract negotiations, because this is where the betrayal aspect becomes clear. Reports indicated that Fox Sports had reached out to Molly with a potential offer worth $2 million per year over 3 years plus bonuses. So here's the situation. Molly has a competing offer that would quadruple her salary, and she's asking ESPN to either match it or give her expanded opportunities to justify staying. Instead of fighting to keep someone who had been essential to their most successful show, ESPN basically said, take it or leave it. But the most damaging part of this entire situation was what happened after Molly's departure became public. Instead of staying quiet and letting her exit gracefully, Stephen A. Smith made some comments that revealed way more than he probably intended to. Remember, this is what Stephen A. said on that first show after Molly left.
We all make decisions that we deem to be in our best interest for whatever reason. And that story is for her to tell. Do I have an idea? Of course I do. Am I going to share it with you? No. Because again, that's her story to tell.
Okay, so far so good. He's being respectful, saying he won't share private details. But then, just a few days later, Stephen A. went on his podcast and said something that absolutely stunned people who were paying attention. He started talking about contract negotiations in general terms, and it became very clear that he wasn't really talking in general terms at all.
Having said that, I want to move on to a broader subject in regards to this. And this part is not about Molly.
But then listen to what he said next.
But when you have negotiations and you're talking with people and you're going back and forth and you're hearing things that you may not want to hear or feeling things you may not want to feel, even though you're valued, even though people acknowledge those kind of things, we live in a world where we have to grow up. And again, I'm not talking about Molly here.
He keeps saying he's not talking about Molly, but then he continues with this.
But I'm watching, and I've been watching over the last several years, people in this business fall by the wayside because we forget that all of us ultimately answer to people. We don't get to define our own value. We don't get to define our own worth.
Now at this point, people are starting to get confused. Stephen A. is claiming he's not talking about Molly, but he just spent several minutes talking about contract negotiations, people overvaluing themselves, and falling by the wayside. What else could he possibly be referring to? Then he really drove the point home with this.
But it can all evaporate in a snap if you lose perspective and you forget that everybody, and I mean everybody, answers to somebody.
This is where a lot of people started connecting the dots. Stephen A. was essentially giving a lecture about knowing your place, about not overvaluing yourself in negotiations, about remembering that everyone has a boss. And he was doing this just days after his co-host of 10 years had left because she felt undervalued and disrespected. The message seemed pretty clear. Molly had overplayed her hand, she had forgotten her place in the hierarchy, and now she was paying the price for it. Whether Stephen A. intended to send that message or not, that's how it was being interpreted by people in the industry. This brings us to the most controversial part of this entire story. What Stephen A. said next would cause such an uproar that even other media personalities started calling him out publicly. And once you hear these comments in full context, you'll understand why so many people felt like Stephen A. had completely betrayed his former partner. Stephen A.'s hypocrisy exposed. What we're about to cover is the most explosive part of this entire saga. Not just Stephen A. Smith's comments about Molly, but his own history of controversial contract negotiations that exposed the massive hypocrisy in everything he said. By the time we're done here, you'll see exactly why Stephen A.'s lecture about knowing your worth is one of the most hypocritical things ever said in sports media. So we left off with Stephen A. making these supposedly general comments about contract negotiations and people overvaluing themselves. But then he took it even further, and this is where things got really uncomfortable, because Stephen A. was about to give a lecture about contract negotiations that completely contradicted his own behavior over the years. Stephen A. was essentially giving a masterclass on humility in contract negotiations, emphasizing that your primary job is to make money for your bosses, and then respectfully ask for your share. The implication seemed to be that Molly had gotten this equation wrong, that she had been too demanding and not humble enough. But here's where this gets absolutely insane. And this is the part that nobody in the mainstream media is talking about. Stephen A. Smith, Lecturing anyone about being humble in contract negotiations is like the pot calling the kettle black, because his own history of contract controversies is absolutely wild. Let me take you back to Stephen A.'s 2024 contract negotiations with ESPN, where he publicly demanded $25 million per year and made it a media circus. This man went on multiple podcasts, gave interviews, and basically turned his contract negotiations into a public spectacle. So much for quietly making your boss's money and humbly asking for your share, right? But it gets even better. During those 2024 negotiations, Stephen A. went on the OG's podcast and accused his critics of trying to sabotage his contract talks. He accuses people of conspiring against him. You think I haven't noticed the steam has elevated since my contract's coming up? You think I'm that stupid? This is the same man who would later lecture about people overvaluing themselves and forgetting their place. He literally accused NBA players of trying to hurt his contract negotiations because they didn't like his takes about them. Then Stephen A. really drove the point home with this statement about Molly's situation. But wait, let me show you what Stephen A. himself said during his own contract negotiations. When asked about reports that he wanted $100 million for 5 years, Stephen A. compared himself to Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. Do you see the hypocrisy here? Stephen A. is telling Molly that she needs to be humble, that she can't define her own worth, that she needs to remember everyone has a boss. But when it came to his own negotiations, he was publicly declaring his worth, comparing himself to NFL quarterbacks and saying he would never apologize for knowing what he's worth. But the hypocrisy goes even deeper. Stephen A.'s contract history is filled with dramatic exits, public disputes, and ego-driven decisions. In 2008 to 2009, he was actually fired from ESPN after a contract dispute and spent 10.5 months unemployed. He later admitted that his ego had gotten in the way of making a smart business decision. So when Stephen A. said this about people falling by the wayside in contract negotiations,
but it can all evaporate in a snap if you lose perspective. And you forget that everybody, and I mean everybody, answers to somebody.
he was literally describing his own experience from 2008 to 2009. He had lost perspective, overvalued himself, and got fired. Yet here he was, lecturing Molly about making the same mistakes he had made. By this point, people in the sports media industry were starting to get really uncomfortable with what they were hearing, not just because of what Stephen A. was saying about Molly, but because of the blatant hypocrisy everyone could see. And nobody was more uncomfortable than Emmanuel Acho, who absolutely went off on Stephen A. during his Speakeasy podcast.
And then add on that, I don't know the details. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing, man?
Like he said this. He said she abruptly resigned. That's a detail.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to say...
Acho was pointing out the contradiction that a lot of people had noticed. Stephen A. was saying he wouldn't share details while simultaneously sharing details. He was claiming he didn't know everything while clearly indicating that he knew more than he was saying. This was the crux of the problem. By using phrases like abruptly resigned and making cryptic comments about uncomfortable situations, Stephen A. had created a narrative that something dramatic and potentially scandalous had happened. But then he refused to provide any context or clarification. But here's what makes this even more hypocritical. During Stephen A.'s own contract negotiations in 2024, he was the one making things sound wild and dramatic. He was giving interviews, going on podcasts, and turning his business negotiations into public entertainment. Yet when Molly's contract situation became public, something she didn't even want, he was criticizing the way it was being handled. Acho jumped in with an even more pointed criticism.
You start to see the...
I also wonder, bro, like from a human perspective, Molly was your sidekick for 10 years. Mm-hmm. We don't need to know she abruptly resigned. Yeah. Protect her at all costs.
Yeah.
That's my big thing.
And then came the line that really summed up what so many people were feeling.
That's the hard part. It's like, at what cost do you get the click, Social Trade?
Yeah,
like,
right,
don't get clicks at cost of Molly.
Yeah, no, that's not
cool. Like, not Molly. Get clicks at cost of some stranger you don't know or some viral video. Right, yeah. I get it. Yeah. You want to get clicks at the cost of LeBron James? I get it. Yeah. But don't get clicks at the cost of a person that's helped you build your empire. That was tough on me.
This criticism becomes even more devastating when you consider Stephen A. His own history of using contract negotiations for content and clicks. During his 2024 negotiations, Stephen A. literally turned his contract talks into content for his podcast, his TV show, and his social media. He was getting clicks and generating buzz by talking about his own negotiations. But when Molly's situation became public, he was treating it like she had done something wrong. Let me show you just how hypocritical this really gets. Remember what Stephen A. said about people overvaluing themselves? Well, in September 2024, Stephen A. went on Who's Talking to Chris Wallace and literally said, "I'm fully aware of what I'm worth," when discussing his contract demands. So it was okay for him to define his own worth, but Molly couldn't do the same. Now here's the really damaging part about Stephen A.'s hypocrisy. During his own contract negotiations, he repeatedly insisted that he deserved top dollar because of what he brought to ESPN. He talked about ratings, revenue, and his value to the network. But when Molly was doing the exact same thing, arguing for her worth based on her contributions to First Take's success, he was essentially saying she was overvaluing herself. Meanwhile, Marcellus Wiley was providing even more insight into what had really happened behind the scenes, and his analysis exposed even more hypocrisy.
Recently about how Stephen A. Smith has that pull. Stephen A. Smith even talked about that when he checked Cam Newton recently, talking about, hey, I've hooked a lot of guys up with money around here.
This was referring to Stephen A.'s influence over other people's contracts at ESPN. The suggestion was that Stephen A. had helped other personalities get better deals, but he hadn't extended that same support to Molly when she needed it. But here's the kicker. Stephen A. had no problem leveraging his influence and position during his own contract negotiations. He used every bit of power and leverage he had, but apparently didn't think Molly should do the same. Wiley continued with even more damaging information.
Is one of the bosses in particular, everyone knows in the industry who that person is, but no need to out him. The point is, that person, along with Stephen A. Smith, ain't seeing the talent, not seeing the love for Molly Qerim. And she knew this.
This was explosive. Wiley was suggesting that Stephen A., along with specific ESPN executives, had actively worked against Molly's interests. But the hypocrisy here is staggering. During his own negotiations, Stephen A. expected and demanded support from ESPN executives. And when he didn't get what he wanted, he made it a public issue. The final nail in the coffin of Stephen A.'s credibility came from analyzing what he did after signing his massive contract extension. Just months after securing his $100 million plus deal, Stephen A. made additional demands and signed supplementary deals with SiriusXM worth another $36 million over 3 years. So much for being humble and grateful for what you get. The more details that emerged, the clearer it became that Stephen A.'s comments weren't just insensitive, they were massively hypocritical, coming from someone whose entire career has been built on aggressive self-promotion, public contract negotiations, and refusing to accept anything less than what he thinks he's worth. But the most damning evidence of Stephen A.'s hypocrisy came from looking at the timeline of his own contract controversies. In 2008 to 2009, Stephen A. literally did exactly what he was now criticizing Molly for. He overvalued himself in contract negotiations, clashed with ESPN executives, got fired, and spent 10.5 months unemployed. He later admitted that his ego had gotten in the way of making smart business decisions. Then in 2013, Stephen A. left ESPN again after controversial comments, moving to SiriusXM before eventually returning in 2014. His 2019 extension was relatively smooth at $60 million over 5 years, but then came the 2024 negotiations that exposed his true character. During those 2024 talks, Stephen A. rejected ESPN's initial offer of $18 million per year, demanding $25 million instead. When details leaked to the media, instead of handling it privately like he expected Molly to do, Stephen A. went on multiple podcasts defending his worth and comparing himself to NFL quarterbacks. He eventually signed a 5-year deal worth $100 million to $105 million in March 2025, plus an additional $36 million from SiriusXM. But even after getting this massive payday, he continued to make comments about people overvaluing themselves in negotiations, comments that many interpreted as shots at Molly. The final piece of evidence that shows Stephen A.'s hypocrisy came from looking at how he handled criticism during his own contract negotiations versus how he handled Molly's situation. When critics questioned Stephen A.'s worth during his 2024 talks, he accused them of trying to sabotage his negotiations. But when Molly's contract situation became public, he essentially joined the critics in questioning her worth and approach. In the end, this story isn't just about one person leaving a TV show. It's about power, loyalty, betrayal, and massive hypocrisy at the highest levels of sports media. Stephen A. Smith spent his entire career being aggressive in contract negotiations, making public demands, refusing to accept less than what he thought he was worth, and leveraging his position for maximum benefit. But when Molly Qerim tried to do the same thing, on a much smaller scale, he lectured her about humility and knowing her place. The report suggests that Molly is now in talks with Fox Sports for a deal worth $2 million per year, which would represent a 400% increase from what ESPN was paying her. Meanwhile, Stephen A. continues to make $20+ million per year while preaching about humility in negotiations. The real tragedy of this story isn't that Molly Qerim left ESPN. The real tragedy is that someone she worked with for 10 years, someone who benefited from her contributions to their shared success, chose to publicly undermine her when she needed support most, all while displaying the exact same behavior he was criticizing her for. Stephen A. Smith's handling of Molly Qerim's departure will go down as one of the most hypocritical moments in sports media history, and the receipts are all there for anyone willing to look at them. Like this video? Click on the card showing on your screen for more.